my trying to be normal has just proved too hard to do. It's easy to say that the cross is at the front when the bookends are so violent compared to the selfless son. But I've tried to be, and I've tried to see like him. I'm glad it's not my fate that I've seen your face, 'cause that's slim. Like Eli said, I wish I didn't care. I've been trying to understand you, but it just seems like you aren't there. I contradict. I'm a walking yes and no. I say that I am either, 'cause I identify with both. But I've tried to be, and I've tried to see like him. I'm glad it's not.
Welcome, everyone. Sorry we're a little late, but we're happy to be here. It's been a minute since we've done a podcast, so we're back. Yeah, so thanks for everybody. Like I said, I see David already in the chat, and Samuel and Nick Quint and Jonathan Becker. So thanks everybody for being here before we even started. But yeah, we're excited. This should be a pretty cool episode. We actually prepared a decent amount, and we're pretty excited to touch on a topic that doesn't really get talked about all too much. I mean, the synoptic problem does, but not Matthean priority or whatever, these type arguments. So, but yeah, the synoptic problem gets talked about a ton. But yeah, so as we're kicking off, just want to say, like, thanks everybody for coming. Definitely to support the video and the channel. You can like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. We're gonna try to get back to doing once a week podcasts. We'll try our best, but maybe we won't make once a week. But we'll be doing them more regularly than we did. But yeah, so just to kind of, and we have a special guest with us today. Yeah, we were already talking beforehand, so I kind of forgot. But yeah, we got actual Dr. Laura Robinson.
Well, and I did want to slightly condition this that, like, you guys prepared. I'm kind of counting the last 8 years of my life as preparation.
Well, yeah, I was about to say, yeah, I think you've done enough preparation before this video came out. But
I did like 3 years, I guess. Yeah, 3. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
But it wasn't all on Matthew, like.
No, it was all on Matthew. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. But yeah, so I can kind of throw it over to John and Laura to say anything before we kind of get started. But yeah, we're excited for this one. I don't know if you guys have any things just to say at the top, but if not, that's fine.
I mean, this is my first Apocalypse Here episode since I haven't been able to participate in a while because I've been drowning in my dissertation. So it's fun to be back and to be able to do this, right? Yeah. So I've got it submitted and defended, and I'm going to be walking on May 13th. So.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Nice.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's got to feel like a enormous weight off your shoulders.
Giant monkey off the back.
You have no idea.
That's how for both of us, honestly.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's. I think most things in the house have gotten a lot more chill since that's been over. So.
Yeah. But so to kind of explain what we're doing today, and I mentioned obviously we're talking about synoptic problem and Markan priority or Matthean priority, whatever the arguments for, and mainly we're going to be talking about like arguments for Mark being first. But and David Pallmann put out a video, who the link to his original videos in the description, and he put out a video. It's actually 3 videos now, and I think he's doing a 4th one soon.
Mm-hmm.
And the one we're mainly touching on is the part 2, where he talks a lot about the arguments for Markan priority and why they don't work. So yeah, we're not going to be touching on the entire video, but we're going to kind of we watched the whole video, so we'll give like start out giving some sort of big picture thoughts and then dive into some of the arguments. And in like the second half of his part 2 video, he goes over like, and he said everyone basically agrees that the argument from editorial fatigue put forward by Mark Goodacre is basically the best argument for Markan Priority. So that's kind of the main one we're going to focus on as far as like specific argument that he lays out in his video.
If we have time, Ethan, I would like to be able to talk a little bit about Christology in the synoptics and about the way in which it's being deployed in this argument, because I think that the question of synoptic evolution of Christology is a lot more complicated than sort of these, much older scholars would have it, right? To be honest. So, anyways, that might be worth talking about.
Okay.
Let's start with
awesome.
let's start with the big picture question of what Mark is for. I think.
Yeah. So. Do we want to start by playing some of his video, or do you want to just talk about?
Yeah, let's start with that. I want to just key up, if you're okay with it, I'd like to key up the question of what Mark is for relative to the other Gospels. And this is sort of this, the reason why I want to start here is because this is where we get this sort of laid out idea of, I guess, sort of a Griesbach light, I guess, is how I would describe this. This idea of Mark as a secondary composition that has a theological agenda that is distinct from Matthew and Luke. I think that would be a good place to start.
I agree. So and you'll see this is kind of like you can see on the bottom here, we're at like 29 minutes into his part 2 video. But I think this is, he presents his argument in a certain way, but I think, like, as we were talking through this, like Laura just said, this is kind of the best place to start. Like, what is the point of Mark? Like, why was it written? What's it trying to accomplish? And so we'll play some of his video and go from there.
I can't hear it.
Yeah, just get the audio on.
Yeah, it didn't. It like the whatchamacallit. StreamYard like changed. I don't see the little thing to share audio, but this should work. But no, wait, audio, but this. It's like you got to share the tab, and I have way too many tabs.
So can I maybe just key it up?
Sure. I think it should work now, though, if you put that on the screen.
Okay, give it a try.
Is the notion that why he does not include them in his gospel. But notice that this puzzle remains even if Mark was written first. And this, in turn, challenges the notion that the puzzle can be used to support Markan Priority. For whether prior or posterior, the mystery of why Mark left out the resurrection appearances remains. This fact should tip us off that whatever other purposes Mark may have had in composing his gospel, one of them was not to give a complete story of the life of Jesus. This, therefore...
Can I stop there?
Central assumption.
Yeah.
Why do we think that his account, like his bios, his gospel, is not to give an account of, like a full account of the life of Jesus? Why do we think that? Why do we think that it's, it seems very plausible to start with Jesus being baptized and then being crucified as a life.
It's of the canonical gospels we have. It's where two of them start.
No. It seems very plausible to just have that account of the life of Jesus. Why isn't that plausible up front? That just seems like a good starting point for an account of
it's not
the life of Jesus, right?
It's not distinct enough from the gospels that we have, canonical or otherwise, to suggest that there is a different intention here.
Exactly.
Right? Because a lot of the non-canonical gospels we have also don't start with the birth of Jesus. So, like we have some narrative gospels that actually just include the birth of Jesus. We have others that start in another place, right? So I don't think starting place in and of itself is enough to suggest that something foundationally different is happening.
I agree.
Right. So that would be a place I would that would be a thing to flag.
Absolutely.
Also, Jonathan Becker is asking if we're taking questions.
Yeah, we will at some point.
Yeah, so maybe flag that up.
Yeah.
Because I think it's a good question. It's just, what does it mean to take up this adoptive problem? It's a great question. Yeah. So maybe we'll take that on in a bit.
We will.
Yeah, we're just gonna try and stay on track.
Look, yeah, all I'm saying is like, why is it not? Why do we think that Mark isn't interested in giving a life of Jesus? Why do we think that?
Yeah.
I don't understand where that's coming from. So,
Sure.
And like you were saying, it seems to correspond with other things that are going on in other gospels. So, yeah.
Which undergirds the argument from additions and omissions.
We'll
Mark
go back
is
to
not
that.
the same type of gospel as Matthew and Luke. Matthew and Luke constitute early Christian didache, that is, teaching for those who were within the faith community and wanted to know more about Jesus. By contrast, the Gospel of Mark is probably early Christian kerygma, that is, a proclamation of the gospel for unbelievers. This distinction is vital.
Yeah.
Is that enough of the argument? You think we can? Is there anything? Does he move from editorial fatigue on from this?
I think pretty soon after this.
All right,
so
cool.
yeah.
Okay, then let's talk about genre for a second. All right. So the argument here, as I understand it, is that Matthew and Luke are in different genres from Mark. Matthew and Luke are didache, which is here being defined. I think he's getting this from Ward. Ward being a I don't remember when he got his doctorate. He got from South African Theological Seminary. But I think he's passed away. Or I might have to mix it with. Hang on 1 second. Ward, what's that? Okay, so he has some publications out with B&H. But anyways, okay, so I think he's getting this idea from B. Ward Powers. Okay, so B. Ward Powers is the person who's put forward this idea that Matthew and Luke are a different genre from Mark, and the genres he is using to distinguish these are didache, which he means a genre of in-house reception for Matthew and Luke, and kerygma for Mark. Okay, so where are these genre labels coming from? One is, I haven't heard the mention of bioi, which is the genre of writing that Burridge defended
in Greek.
Yes,
it's a Greek term.
Right. So the idea that the Gospels are their own genre, that gospel is itself a genre, is sort of a 19th century argument that Christianity just invented its own genre to create the life of Jesus, right? And where Burridge has really argued with this is the idea that genre is not really something you can just invent ad hoc. Genre is a writing tool an author can take on because it's an interpretive tool for the reader, right? If you start with the idea that you're reading a certain genre, then you have an idea of what to do with this text as you're reading through it, right? So Burridge argued that genre as sort of this like new creation for a movement itself doesn't really make any sense, because if you're not part of this movement, then you don't know how to use this as an interpretive tool, right? Okay. So that was where he put the Gospels in conversation with the idea of a bioi, like a bios being a life of a prominent figure, right? So this is the life of a person who you're supposed to emulate, which might contain some details of the birth of a person and maybe some like early childhood details that suggest that this person is headed for great things. That is normally just told from the use of the use of pronouns and verbs and nouns also suggests that all of the action is centering on this one person, and that we are supposed to take this narrative as an example for the reader as someone who you follow all the way through, right? So Burridge is the person who really defended the idea that the Gospels emerge from an established genre, that they emerge from bioi, the lives of famous figures, right? So what Ward Powers is arguing is that it's not true that the Gospels are existing in an established genre in Greco-Roman literature. It doesn't even seem like he's going the Pallmann route, that the Gospels are their own genre. He's going with the idea that there are multiple genres within the realm of Gospels, right? So he is argued that Matthew and Luke are Didache, while Mark is Kerygma. Okay, so some questions. All right. Didache is not a genre, right? Didache is the name of an early Christian book called the Didache that is just clearly not the same genre as the Gospels. The Didache is entirely what we call paranetic teaching. Paranetic meaning teaching, right? It's meant for instruction. So there's no narrative happening in the Didache, right? It's about the two ways of virtue and lack of virtue, and then some details about how to take the Eucharist, for instance, right, or how to baptize somebody. There's this very particular instruction for what to do with the formative church, right? So Didache is not a genre, and I would be really interested to hear if Ward Powers has any other examples of narrative texts that he would describe as Didache, except for these two texts. So we already have this huge problem happening that Didache is not a genre. If it is, it seems like for David's argument to work, they would have to be the only texts within this genre, and that this genre is described as narratives that are primarily meant to be read by other Christians. Okay, put a pin in that. All right. So then the next thing that we're arguing is that Mark is not the same genre as these other texts, that Mark is Kerygma. Where's the term of Kerygma come from? Kerygma comes from the term kerusso, which is the Greek word for to preach, right? So Kerygma emerges in the 19th century as this way of describing basically literary creations from preaching, that once Christians start having this proclamation of who Jesus is and why he matters, texts start to emerge around the center label of like, what are the most essential elements of Christianity, right? And everything centers on this idea of Kerygma, right? So the way in which David is using it is Kerygma as a genre, which is not how anybody uses this term. Kerygma is mostly used to describe a phenomenon of how pericopes emerge as literary texts, right? And he is arguing that while Matthew and Luke are in their own genre, they're only meant to be consumed by Christians, Mark is meant to be consumed by non-Christians. It is meant to be received as a text that you would give to non-Christians or preach to non-Christians with the goal of making them Christians. So, okay, so a few questions emerge here. All right. The biggest one for me would be comparisons between Matthew, Mark, and Luke is enough of an indication these are all different genres and they are all meant to be used in different settings. There's a huge problem here that 90% of Mark is in Luke. So 90% of Mark is in Matthew and 60% of Mark is in Luke. And most of the passages that overlap are in similar orders, and overwhelmingly they use the same verbiage, right? So we have three documents that are remarkably similar, but they're all in different genres. How do we distinguish between them? Secondly, we have this idea that Mark is meant to be read to groups of non-Christians. Okay, so there's an external problem here. What is the external setting in the life of a text where you would read the Gospel of Mark to a group of non-Christians who have been gathered for the purpose of being converted to Christianity? What is this context? Is there any literary or historical record of a group of non-Christians gathering to hear a whole book read at them, right? And if not a whole book, do you mean a short passage from it? In which case, why are Matthew and Luke not perfectly suitable for this opportunity, right? Why can you not read a short passage from this and then expound on it with an evangelistic message? So those all seem like very obvious questions to me of what is the situation in which Mark will be used for evangelism? Do you mean that Mark will be printed and circulated as a pamphlet for people to independently read? If so, what is the mechanism by which this text will be copied by hand and circulated and printed? This sort of seems to be not incredibly likely, because while Mark is not very long, it's also not a pamphlet. It's not incredibly short. These would be circulating among people who overwhelmingly can't read, so they can't really do anything with a pamphlet anyways. And then what is the way in which this would be received and accepted, right? So whatever we mean with an evangelistic purpose of a gospel, what we mean is a place where you could plausibly get a non-Christian into a setting and then be able to explain the text for them to this audience, right? So that's all the external problems. So we already have a ton of issues here. That already seems to me that what Word Powers is saying Mark is for just doesn't make any sense. I mean, I would have to have a copy of his dissertation. I looked around online. I could not find a copy of it. Oh, well, I tried. And, but more to the point, internally, when we compare Mark and Luke to Mark to Matthew and Luke, what is the evidence that Mark is better suited for the task of winning over non-Christians? Yeah, and this is where I am just not seeing any evidence whatsoever, right? Mark does not have any references to, there's no stories of people being converted or coming to the faith, for instance, right? Mark's primary redactional profile, if I had to just describe it in sum, is that it is shorter.
And just not to cut you off, but just as you use that term, I don't want to like throw out too many terms that people, if they're following along. So just redactional profile, you're just referring to like the differences between Mark and Matthew and Luke.
Yeah, redaction specifically means like taking on board and editing, right? So I'm entertaining the idea that if Mark is editing Matthew,
using Matthew
and
Luke,
yeah, what would this profile look like? The thing that makes Mark quite distinct is that all the individual stories are much longer than they are in the other Gospels. There's a lot more details, but the Gospel itself is shorter. So I assume what is being argued is that Mark is better for evangelism than these other texts because the entire document is shorter. So again, in a non-literate society, this means that Mark is best suited for evangelism because by virtue of being a shorter book, it's an easier sell to get people to sit down to hear the entire thing read to them, which is to me just a bonkers concept. What is the situation? What is the network that would emerge by which people would just sit down and have this whole book read to them? And if that were to happen, what would be the expected result? There's no like call to action at the end of Mark. There's no call and response. There's no it's not clear to me what you would want to have happen among an exclusively non-Christian audience as a result of having this entire thing read to them if they didn't leave somewhere around the 8th chapter. So I already have a lot of questions about what is the setting imagined for this book to be, quote unquote, charismatic. If by charismatic we mean evangelistic, in which case evangelistic is not really a genre of early Christian literature, and neither is charismatic anyways. So there's already a lot of problems here.
Yeah, and maybe just to throw some out as you're talking, what I'm kind of thinking, if this really is the case that like Mark was written for the specific purpose, to be read fully to a group of non-Christians, that just seems so odd that like that is not the way Paul does evangelism.
No, it's not
at all.
No.
So like, why is there just this like huge switch around of like how we're doing things?
So here's the evidence I'd want to hear from David to defend this argument. I would want to hear evidence that there's a historical setting where people will, in roughly around the 1st century, where people who are non-practitioners of a sectarian movement will sit down and have a document read to them front to back. Which I think has to be the
to them.
Yeah,
preach to
which
them.
I think,
which
yes.
like preaching is another issue here too.
What is the preaching?
What does that even
right?
mean?
Yeah, are you expounding on the text? Are you? Because the only thing I can see that makes Mark more friendly to non-believers is the fact that it's just literally shorter as an entire text.
Yeah.
There's not more explanation of who Jesus is or what liturgical practice in the church is, or how the Jesus movement is related to Judaism or
Right.
early Judaism. There's just nothing in here that to me suggests being accessible to a novice audience, right? Except for the fact that it's literally shorter, which means we need a situation in which people will sit down and have this entire thing read to them. So
Yeah,
that
and just
yeah.
and just to not gloss over that, because I think it's really important, is like you keep mentioning that it has to be the whole book read to them,
Yeah.
because if it is only a part, then that doesn't explain why Matthew and Luke aren't just as well suited for the
Well,
job.
and again, because like the thing that sets Mark apart is that the text is literally shorter because of the lack of material in it, but all of the stories in it are themselves longer.
Yeah.
Right.
So if you're only going to read parts, then Matthew and
Yeah.
Luke are just as good or better, probably, because
right,
they're even shorter.
or if you're going to set aside a longer section from Mark as being especially good for preaching, what about the length of the individual sections makes it particularly good for evangelism, right? So like one of the obvious examples, a text that is much longer in Mark than in Matthew is the execution of John the Baptist, right? What about the longer, more discursive narrative about the execution of John the Baptist that involves Herodias and her daughter? What makes that better suited for evangelism? I don't see any evidence it is. And like, I honestly don't think David thinks there's any evidence that there is, because then when he takes on this passage, it's, oh, Mark is adding in some more information so you understand it better, right? So again, what does this have to do with evangelism? It sounds like what David is saying is that this is better suited to explain to Christians why exactly John died, given all the internal intrigue in Herod's household, which non-Christians aren't going to give a damn about, which is not relevant for them. So it actually seems like David is cutting across his own hypothesis here.
Yeah, so it almost seems like you could easily make the same, or well, you could make like the opposite argument that Mark is better, is Didache, if you're gonna make up this genre.
Matthew
because
Didache is what he's
well,
saying.
no, I'm saying he says that, but I'm saying you could one could make the argument that Mark is for Christians because the individual stories are longer.
He
and
has more
detailed.
details, right? So you'd easily turn, if you want to pretend Didache and Kerygma exist as genres, and they don't. If you want,
that's not a thing.
They're not genres.
It's not a thing that's recognized by anybody other
No.
than that guy.
This one dissertation from
Howers.
From Ward Howers from South African Theological Seminary. So if we want to pretend these genres exist, and they don't, you could very easily make a case that the genres are actually represented in the opposite direction, that Mark is providing more information, more details to texts that are given very brief introduction in Matthew, right? So
and leaving out some stories that the Christians already heard when they were evangelized with the Kerygma, basically.
Right, so
don't need those anymore.
Good point.
So the big problem here is there's a really facile engagement with the question of what it means to be longer and shorter, right? Is that it seems like the only thing that's taken on board is that Mark is just literally shorter, right?
Yeah.
And there's no attention to the fact that on the individual stories, Mark is actually not an abbreviation at all. Mark just has less material, but every individual pericope is expanded upon relative to, well, not ever. I mean, I don't want to make that big of a claim, but generally speaking, the pericopes are expanded on relative to Matthew and Luke. So whatever you're going to say is an abbreviation. What we mostly mean here is an omission and expansion, right? And why is that useful for evangelism? And what if you want to say it's because if you get this down to a few key stories that somehow don't include the Sermon on the Mount or the Lord's Prayer or the birth of Jesus or resurrection appearances, that none of that is useful for evangelism. Okay, what you want to say is that Mark has picked a select number of stories that are particularly useful for evangelism for some reason.
And also we know how uncomfortable later Christians were with the fact that Mark didn't have resurrection
because they keep adding
because we have three endings to Mark.
So
we have three, like in the manuscript tradition, we have three endings to Mark because they read Mark, obviously, and we're like, no, we need this stuff added on
Right.
the back end.
So again, even if Mark is picking out select stories that are good for evangelism, in which case, what on earth are his criteria? Why is it useful to just add some details here and there? Like, there are other boats with Jesus on the sea during the stilling of the storm. Why is that so necessary for evangelism that Mark had to add it in, right? And I know what he's going to say is that he heard that from Peter, which is even weirder because I guess Matthew, if we're going to go with apostolic authorship the whole way down, somehow Matthew didn't remember these other boats. So, okay, whatever. So that's all. It's all odd, right? So what I'm just saying is none of this adds up to what David wants to say it adds up to. It doesn't add up to a document that is useful for evangelism, even if you could contrive a situation where a bunch of non-Christians would hear you read a book start to finish, which there's no situation where that would happen that I can think of. If David can find one, Yahtzee, I would be so excited to hear about it, but I don't think it exists. So anyways, and then this actually... Roberto brings up a really good point here that the Great Commission is missing from Mark. I mean, I actually don't know if David has an account of the endings of Mark. He might think the longer ending of Mark is valid, in which case, take it up with the text critics. But I think that's a really fair point to make here, that if we're going to say that like Mark is the evangelistic gospel, how come there is a missiological discourse in Matthew and a commission to a worldwide mission at the end of Matthew, and neither of them are in Mark, except for this very, he has is hyper abbreviated version of the missiological discourse. So it's not even clear what role mission has in Mark's gospel. So none of this stuff works internally, is what I'm trying to say, is that, it's the only evidence I can find for David's point is the fact that Mark is literally shorter. But then that has nothing to do with what we know about first century Christian reading, right? So this all looks wrong to me.
Yeah. Agreed.
Yeah. I think the only I think you're totally on point. And what I would add is if David wants to make this argument, you really, like you said, like we pointed out a number of times, really all he points out is the word count of the document.
Yeah.
And I'd love to get into the specific internal, what Mark has in it compared to Matthew and Luke. And like Roberto says, when you do that, you don't find it doesn't lead you to think that this would be used for evangelism. If you didn't take the length into account at all, because I don't, like you said, there's really nothing to support this idea that people are going to sit down and hear an entire book preach to them. So let's take out the length and look at what the text has. You would not come to this conclusion that Mark is for evangelism while Matthew and Luke are for Christians.
No, I don't think so. I mean, Mark is good at telling individual stories. He has more details, and there's more dramatic irony and that kind of thing. But I think what you would need to demonstrate is that Mark is doing this for the purpose of evangelism, right? That's not what I'm saying. And I also, the direction David could take this, if he wanted to, is putting Mark in conversation with other more narrative and fantastical gospels that actually are really centered on storytelling, right? So the infancy gospel of Thomas, right? There are some places you could take this, with the concept of storytelling and narrative devices to show how these develop in Christian literature over time. But I don't think he wants to. I think he wants to really keep it canonical. So the interesting stuff you could even do with these observations
aren't really
I'm
possible.
just not seeing there.
Yeah. So just to kind of put a cap on this, the reason, I think, if people are seeing this and think we're just nitpicking this one random part from the middle of his video, we definitely aren't.
This is the central argument. Why does Mark look the way it does? This is the central argument. You have to if you're going to make a claim about literary relationships between the Gospels, you have to account for why the Gospels look the way they do.
Exactly.
And not just it's one thing to look at the individual stories and try to figure out who is using who. That builds you to a larger conclusion. But the Griesbach hypothesis, which I think is what David wants to defend, but he he adds in a bunch of other stuff with a bunch of other like putative oral sources, essentially. You have to be able to explain why do the Gospels look the way they do. And I don't think there is any defense to be made in light of the one he's trying to say. It's just, there's no claim there, right? It's like, how widely accepted is McGrew's thesis? It's not, there is no McGrew thesis. Like, nobody cares. Like, this is not a thesis in New Testament scholarship. This is just a thing that circulates around online, right? So, anyways.
Yeah, so I think that we can kind of
Nick Quinn, by the way.
Oh, hi,
Yeah.
Nick. How are you doing? Oh
yeah.
my gosh. Hi, Nick. Good to see you. Say
So
hi to
yeah,
Allison for me. I just know everybody on here.
I don't know if he's gonna respond in the.
Okay.
We'll just sit here quietly till he leaves another comment.
All right.
No. But yeah, so I think that's pretty very well put. That like this is why we wanted to start here. That we really like this is the central thing. That like if you can't explain the reason for like the purpose of the documents and the motivations behind the author writing what they did, then yeah, then the individual stories aren't gonna like the individual arguments aren't, they flow from there. So I think, but moving forward, I think he starts to touch on whatchamacallit, editorial fatigue. So we could play a little more of his video and then kind of talk about that. If you want to put the video back, it's at the bottom.
Yep.
Because it explains why Mark is shorter and omits so much material in view of the fact that it was intended to be preached to non-Christians who likely wouldn't be willing to dedicate as much time to hearing about Jesus,
But they
who
would
not
sit
be as
down and
curious
listen.
about the details of Jesus' birth
That's
or
not a
his
very long
believer-specific
verse, yeah.
teachings, such as the Sermon on the Mount. Ward.
Yeah, that seems odd to think. Like he even mentions like the Sermon on the Mount. Like, yeah, I don't know.
That's way
It
too
just-
long, but Mark
Yeah.
is fine.
Mark,
right?
yeah, Mark,
Hours
he's
argues.
short enough. It
16
doesn't take that
chapters of
long.
Mark as opposed
fine.
to 28 chapters.
You can skip past this.
About to say, do we
So,
want to kind of skip? As we talked about all
hours,
this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
So we'll touch on a little bit of the summary of what he says, just to make sure we
His
don't miss.
omissions, nor even his language, support the theory of Markan priority.
Okay, yeah. So I don't know. But like, Mark's unique material does not support Markan priority. I mean,
But he doesn't really engage Mark's unique material. Is the thing that I was really frustrated in this. Is like I wanted to know, why does Mark add in the numerological saying at the end of the feeding of the 4,000? Right? What's going on with that? Or why does Mark add in the fact that there are other boats on the sea when they sail to the Gadarene demoniacs, right? Or why does Mark have like all these like little the extension of the salted with fire verse, right? There's so many places where he just doesn't engage unique Markan material, right? Which there's just not that much of it, but he doesn't explain why Mark would add it in. Again, for the thing he's committed himself to is that it's more useful for evangelism, right? So why are more boats on the sea on the way across to the Gadarene demoniac? Why is that more useful for evangelism, right? Why is the numerological saying about the baskets left behind after the feeding of the 4,000? Why is that useful for evangelism, right? So there's just there's a lack of engagement with the specific Markan material, such as it is, especially when you really get into the text critical issues and talk about things like the church fathers attesting to the tradition of Jesus being enraged at the leper when he heals him, right? There's a lot of there's a lot of material he just doesn't deal with. So like Mark's unique material doesn't support Markan priority. Well, what is it, David? What is the Markan unique material, and why is it secondary? You have to explain that. So that's a problem. And then the material that's absent from Mark does not support Markan priority. Okay, well, Mark, as it exists, as an abbreviation, doesn't support what he says Mark is doing. We can talk more about the absence from that and what that means, but anyways. And Mark's language doesn't support Markan Priority. That's going to be a little bit more complicated to get to this question of what does rougher mean in Mark and the linguistic. Yeah. So
we can keep going. Yeah.
So,
nor even his language. The new argument developed for Markan Priority is the argument from editorial fatigue, spearheaded by Mark.
Yeah, Jonathan.
Goodacre defines editorial fatigue as follows. Editorial fatigue is a phenomenon that will inevitably occur when a writer is heavily dependent on another's work. In telling the same story as his predecessor, a writer makes changes in the early stages which he is unable to sustain throughout. Like continuity errors in film and television, examples of fatigue will be unconscious mistakes, small errors of detail, which naturally arise in the course of constructing a narrative. They are interesting because they can betray an author's hand, most particularly in revealing to us the identity of his sources. So the idea is that Matthew and Luke...
Do we want to let him explain editorial fatigue a little more?
So, I mean, here's the thing, is that he reads off a really good definition of editorial fatigue, and then he doesn't apply it to any of the examples. So this is this is my issue with what's coming next, is that David seems to me very fixated on the idea that editorial fatigue discovers contradictions between the Gospels. That's not what editorial fatigue does.
Right.
Editorial fatigue determines literary relationships. That is the purpose of this. And he gets so close to finding a really interesting example in Mark, and he doesn't go for it because he can't make himself talk about internal contradictions of the gospel. Okay.
Okay, can I just say something real quick? When we're talking about editorial fatigue, we're talking about narrative and literary inconsistencies.
Yeah. We're not talking about historical contradictions.
We're not talking about anything to do with whether facts are true or not. That's not what we're talking about.
Yeah.
That's not what historians are talking about.
Yeah.
At all. This is what David doesn't seem to get.
He immediately pitches it into harmonization. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, sorry.
Every time he addresses the narrative sort of rough patches in, like, potentially, Matthew's use of Mark or whatever, he'll immediately step over into an entirely different apologetic discourse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And he'll try to harmonize these things.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
This is not what historians do.
Right.
This is not what they do. And it's not what they're concerned with. This is like, it's like historians are speaking Spanish and then someone gives like an attempted sort of solution in like Arabic or something.
Mm-hmm.
Like, this is not the issue.
Especially given the thought that like these books are meant to be read like all the way through on their own, right? And maybe he doesn't want to say that Matthew and Luke are meant for that.
Sorry.
Yeah, but I just want to say that like if there's internal inconsistencies and the book's meant to be read on its own all the way through, then we have a problem, right? Like to pull in another text to solve that problem doesn't seem to make much sense if you're arguing that the books are meant to be read by themselves all the way through.
So here's the thing. Right. So I there's some debate about whether or not this is actually meant to be read in one sitting or not, right? But I do think the thing that we lose sight of, because we have a book that has them all bound together, is these are supposed to be documents that stand on their own, right? There is no... It's difficult to figure out what evidence would count as the idea that these are supposed to all be read together, in light of the fact especially that they bring so much of the other's language on board, right? So it's hard to see if we really want to commit to the idea that Matthew, Mark, and Luke are just to be read as a set all together and then add in John, right? Why is there so much borrowing? Why is there so much adoption of each other's languages? That looks way more to me like an author who is trying to replace replace the other's text, right? Why would you bring so much of this on board as the others, right? So here's the thing, is that David makes a whole video about Markan Priority, and he doesn't actually ever engage the argument. One of the primary arguments for Markan Priority, which is editorial fatigue, because he keeps getting distracted by this idea of historical contradictions, which is actually not related to the question of Markan Priority at all. So I don't know why he wanders down this path, except that he's just not interested in Markan Priority at the end of the day. So and this is part of why, I felt like I watched this video and I was really struggling to figure out what to say about it, because I was like, this isn't even about Markan Priority. This is about something else. Maybe we should talk about what editorial fatigue actually is. That was a perfectly good definition, right? Editorial fatigue is the idea that one person is editing and copying from another person, and they are adding in their own additions at the beginning of the story that are coherent with their larger theological and narrative purposes, right? As the story goes along, we suddenly have details from the original source that do not fit with the theological and literary project of the author who is copying, but they are bringing them on board because they are dependent on the source, right? So they introduce a disconnect in their story, but the disconnect, the thing that makes editorial fatigue noticeable is the idea that suddenly we can see that the disconnect is at odds with the larger literary and theological project, right? So Matthew and Herod, right? For Matthew, Herod is this sort of like consistently villainous figure because the king of Jerusalem is this violent character who opposes Jesus and the Magi and kills all the innocents. And he is thoroughgoingly evil in the narrative where he kills John the Baptist. And then suddenly he has this moment of being sad that he has to kill John the Baptist at the end of the story. Why did he suddenly do this? Well, because he's sad at the end of Mark's story where Matthew is actually not, because he's sad at the end of Mark's story where Herod is not a thoroughgoing evil character, right? That's the question you have to engage, right? Is why would Mark take this story and change it so that it is it changed it in the other direction, right? And this is where David just kind of wanders away from the question of synoptic
and just he just tries to
harmonize them, right? Yeah. Because then he gets really interested in this question of, well, both of these stories can be true at the same time. Great. Who used who, right? Is there like, are you trying to argue that Mark used Matthew instead, or are you trying to argue that these stories are true at the same time? If you're trying to say they can be true at the same time, awesome.
That's a
you have
different
said nothing
discourse.
about Markan Priority.
That's an entirely different discourse.
Right, but I don't think David knows the difference.
Yeah, and then you're essentially arguing for like literary independence. I mean,
he does the same thing with the stealing of the storm.
Yeah, exactly. Right? Yeah, so I mean, we can get into this.
Yeah, it's the same thing. Like, basically, what David is doing is the sort of like harmonization of the gaps. Yeah. Like, anytime there's any sort of like rough patch in a literary kind of situation, we need to figure out how to harmonize this stuff, right? And like, no historian is doing that. No, we're just trying to figure out what's going on literarily. That's it. We're not trying to figure out whether or not something is true or factual or not. No. I don't know why that's being imposed onto this project.
Well, and then also the level of, even if we were going to say that he's trying to figure out historical differences, the level of historical differences he is centering on are so petty that they just have no bearing on actual historical scholarship whatsoever. Right. Unless you are really committed to every single detail of the Gospels lining up for an unrelated to history reason. So saying that, like Herod could have both not been interested in Jesus. Herod could have both been interested in John the Baptist, and he also could have been beholden to Herod. Yeah, exactly.
He could have been sad at the end.
These differences are so petty and have nothing to do with the larger historical conversation of why did Herod execute John the Baptist, where we have these general gospel agreements that
No,
go to.
I mean, this is exactly what we're saying. Like, it's because it's about apologetics. It's not about.
It has nothing to do with
History,
history. And this has nothing to do with how people actually do history, right? Because like Josephus has an account of the execution of John the Baptist that has nothing to do with Herod's marriage to Herodias. It is part of this like larger issue of Herod versus charismatic figures, right? Then we have the Gospels where everyone agrees it has to do with Herod's marriage. And you really have to be not interested in history as a discipline or non-canonical sources to be so fixated on this very specific historical question of whether Herod was sad. It's just not what history is. And like, okay, fine, you can smash them together and make them all fit together. Yahtzee, you're not a historian. That's not the project. No one is interested in this conversation but you.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, and just to add, like, I think if, like, the way he's going about this, like, this harmonization, like, all this kind of relies on traditional apostolic authorship of the gospel.
Then follow
yeah, but if that's the case, just to say, then it really doesn't make any difference which one was written first or not, because that's just really an argument.
Markan Priority.
Yeah,
why is this video called Markan Priority? He never defends an alternative literary relationship. He never gets that far.
Yeah, if these really were written by eyewitnesses and whatnot, like then like the order, all that really is like who finished their writing first.
Yeah,
like, it
who
doesn't
literally got across the finish line first. Yeah,
it really doesn't matter. Like the only reason the order matters is because that determines who used who. The literary dependence. It doesn't really matter, like the order. It has nothing to do with time.
Can I show another piece of evidence for directionality here that he does, because he's not interested in Luke here, really.
He never does anything with Luke.
Can you pull up, Ethan? Can you pull up Mark 6:32 to 36?
Yeah.
Within themselves.
Hold on.
Can you do like a parallel thing?
Yeah, it's like only wanting to share a tab. Like I had to hit on like a tab or whatever. But what'd you say, Luke 6?
Luke 6:32 to 36. Or sorry, Mark 6:32 to 36, and then Luke 9.
Okay.
10 to 12.
Let me.
Can you do it side by side?
Yeah, you can on this one, I think. So I know there's. Yeah. So what do we want? This one is Luke. Luke what?
Luke 9, 10 to 12.
9. Okay, well, it's not going to let me scroll one.
That's fine. So the idea here is that, I mean, this is another great example of editorial fatigue that works in one direction and does not work in the other direction. Okay. So in these texts, we have...
Yeah, it's not letting me do the two different ones, but it doesn't matter. Yeah.
That's fine. So there is a characteristic of the way that Luke changes places from his sources. So he'll change stuff. In this case, he changes the location of this situation to Bethsaida. Okay. Mm-hmm. Mark's narrative is perfectly consistent throughout. It's in a deserted place in Mark. Okay. In Luke, it's in Bethsaida. Bethsaida is not a deserted place at all. Okay. Once you go through, Luke pulls through Mark's account of this was in a deserted place here, going through. Okay. Bethsaida is not a deserted place at all. So it seems clear that Mark is making a characteristic change up front, right? Mm-hmm. To say this is in Bethsaida now. but then pulls through Mark's, this is in a deserted place, and we need to go elsewhere to find food, sustenance, all of that sort of stuff. That seems pretty clear. It shows that Luke really is interested in kind of changing locations. He does that from time to time, right? The solution for historians is not harmonizing this stuff, like we were saying. That's not what we're doing, unless you presuppose that we have to do that.
Mm-hmm.
That's the issue. But David never actually argues for why we really should presuppose that in our investigation of these texts, right? He never actually does that. It's a hard case to make up front, right? And he never does that, right?
Yeah.
No one does that except for conservative apologists.
Yeah.
Nobody does
These
that.
are the only people he's in conversation with.
We're trying to figure out
yeah.
what the literary relationship between texts actually is. Okay? That's the thing that historians are actually concerned about. Okay?
Yeah.
And like the most plausible direction here, right, is Matthew and Luke are using Mark. That's the most plausible literary direction of these things. We don't care whether or not these are contradicting the truth of the matter or the facts of the matter. We're talking about texts and whether or not a narrative is consistent in the way that it's telling it. Okay.
And again, that is the core of what editorial fatigue is about. Editorial fatigue is about whether or not a story is consistent in its telling in a way that would make sense for an author who is working first, or for an author who is including contradictions based on the fact that he's using a source.
Yeah.
This is what is at issue here. And I don't think David quite gets that. So actually, can you play the Matthew 8:2 one? Is really interesting here. If you want to go forward a little bit.
From his video.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So
Yeah.
I mean, the Herod one is just hash, and I don't really think it's worth talking about, because he gets really into the question of how could Herod both be interested in John the Baptist and also be sad, and I just don't think David understands what the argument is. So I don't really think there's a lot to talk about there. It's just.
So you were saying this Matthew 8.
Let's talk about that first one. Yeah.
Okay.
In Mark, Jesus tells the leper, "See that you say nothing
go
to
back
the
a little
original details into their version of the story later on, and thereby create some level of inconsistency or In Mark, Jesus tells the leper, "See that you say nothing to anyone, but go show yourself to the priest." In Matthew's version of the story, prior to the healing of the leper, Matthew adds the fact that crowds were following Jesus. When Jesus came down from the mountain, large crowds followed him.
Yeah, that was
Yet,
pretty
after
hilarious.
healing the leper,
be honest.
Matthew follows Mark's wording by having Jesus say to the leper that he has just healed, "See that you tell no one, but go show yourself to the priest." From this, Goodacre argues...
Jack it forward a little bit. Hang on.
Yeah.
So he gets
At the end
to the thing he is catching here that is true is that the leper for the leper for Mark is by himself, and Jesus says, "Don't tell anybody." Whereas in Mark, in Matthew, in Mark the leper is by himself. In Matthew, there's a big crowd. In both cases, at the end of the story, Jesus says, "Don't tell anybody." In Matthew, it doesn't make any sense because they're not by themselves. That the whole crowd has just seen this. Why would Matthew say this? Okay, so that's can you jack it forward to that Matthew? Can you jack it forward to that Mark 7 story about the healing of the deaf mute? Oh, sorry. Actually, okay, hang on.
It's the counter example.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So the first thing he does say is that the great crowds following Jesus is just the end of the Sermon on the Mount and not the beginning of the healing of the leper. Fine. However we divide
no one cares.
However we divide up this text, it remains true that the leper appears after the Sermon on the Mount, right? So I think what David wants to be true with Power Word is the idea that there is this putative time jump between the end of the Sermon on the Mount when everyone's following Jesus and then the healing of the leper. In which case, citation needed, please. There's no indication that there's a time jump. There's no like change in the verb tenses or anything that would suggest this is happening at different times. The crowd is there. These stories follow one another. It doesn't really matter how we're trying to divide up the pericopes. Everybody's there. Okay, so then he gets into the Mark 7 thing, which I was like, I was so mad at this because I actually think he got so close to making a good argument, but he's too inerrantist. And, okay.
7:32-37, there is a similar story where Jesus heals a deaf and mute man in front of a multitude and tells the entire multitude not to tell anyone what he has done. Is it so difficult to imagine that something similar happened in Matthew 8? Couldn't Jesus have likewise told the crowds not to tell anyone what had happened?
Okay, pause it.
Clearly, according to Mark.
Okay, so David actually finds a really fascinating counterexample here, and just I'm going to give credit where credit is due. This is a really interesting case where a story in Mark has internal inconsistencies. That Jesus is coming out of Tyre and Sidon, and Mark loves his verbs with no antecedents, right? Just these they stories, right? Where some people just bring him a deaf mute, and Jesus takes him aside from the crowd privately, which is very consistent with Mark's style, that Jesus is always trying to do healing privately and not get attention. And then he heals him, and then Jesus tells them not to tell anyone, right? So here's the argument I would make if I had thought of this first, is that Mark has a example here of a story with multiple internal inconsistencies that don't owe to a known source, right? So we can't credit this to editorial fatigue. We just have internal inconsistencies that are coming from, apparently, if they're sources we don't know, or just the author writing independently, right? This is a really interesting counterexample.
Oh, it could be Peter, and he just sucks at telling stories.
Yeah, okay, fine. But anyway, so the thing is you have a great example here of where internal inconsistencies can come from that don't come from a known source or a redactional source, right? Okay, that's the argument you would make. What David does with this is that we can clearly see from this that Jesus is in the habit of telling entire crowds not to tell anyone about a healing. So here are the problems with it, is that he just glances right over the inconsistencies, which would make his point so much better than the point he's actually making, is that there's a crowd imagined, I think, in this third person verb of they begged him to do this, that there must be a crowd. And then Jesus takes them away from the crowd. So they're by themselves now. But then suddenly the crowd is back. And Jesus says that he told them not to do this. And then this isn't even, but then none of this actually tells us anything about Matthew 8 too, and the healing of the leper there. Because Jesus in that pericope doesn't tell the leper, he doesn't tell the crowds not to tell anyone. He doesn't redact this. He doesn't say, and then Jesus told the crowds not to tell anyone, or he said, don't tell them not to tell anyone. He tells the leper not to tell anyone. So the crowd has just vanished again. So in both of these texts, we have this vanishing crowd and this reappearing crowd, but he doesn't notice this because he's so eager to create this historical norm that Jesus would tell a crowd not to say he's been healed, when that's not even what happens in Matthew 8. So there's an interesting argument to be made here about the limits of editorial fatigue, and David doesn't notice it because his harmonizing impulses are so overpowering of any literary or historical argument you might make. So I found this part very frustrating because I was very excited to find a really good historical argument, and then it just never happened. And I had to make it myself. So anyways, such is life. Okay.
Interesting. No, that's super interesting, actually. Yeah. So, yeah, I'm not sure. You're right. It's very strange that So he uses this. So basically what's going on here is using this Mark 7 to make the claim that it's normal for Jesus to tell an entire crowd.
And he doesn't even put editorial fatigue. Again, why is this video called Markan Priority?
Yeah, that is the claim that we want to make.
He doesn't
why is this going after editorial
Yeah.
fatigue.
Mhm.
Why is this going after Markan Priority?
You-
This
yeah.
is actually not doing anything against Markan
Yeah.
Priority. For the most part, in this video, he's going after very, very old arguments.
Yeah.
And then he shifts to Mark Goodacre, really.
Yeah.
He
but then
doesn't
doesn't
really
actually
understand
engage
what Mark
Goodacre.
Goodacre is
No.
doing. He doesn't
Yeah.
understand what editorial fatigue is, as we've tried to show.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's yeah.
The
Yeah,
argument
so
in
I
response
told-
to this would- okay, sorry,
Yeah.
real fast. The argument in response to this would be that the Matthew 8 story is literally first, and then the Mark story is secondary. And how do the changes fit with Mark's redactional profile? That's the argument David has to make for the argument he says he wants to make. He doesn't ever really get close. Like, there's an
But-
interesting argument here against the concept of editorial fatigue, but as I said, I had to make it, David didn't. So,
Yeah, but to posit like what Jesus did like in real life to explain to explain the difference, like you're right. Like now it really clicked. Like that doesn't address the question
no,
at
has
hand
nothing to do with
in
literary
any
logic.
way. Like
Yeah.
yeah, it really doesn't. Even if what he's saying is right, like that Jesus told, like somehow we found out that like Jesus really does tell huge crowds to like not go do this or whatever. Like it doesn't really matter because what we're addressing is the literary dependence of the
Yeah, and it's
Gospels.
not even what Mark. It's not what
Yeah.
Matthew says happened anyways. So
Yeah, but just to say, like, anytime he's gonna want to posit like harmonization and like actual like the historical facts of what actually happened,
he just
you're
yeah.
arguing something completely different. Like
Yeah.
then that's
that's
why I said
what,
it kinda
yeah,
just
that's what I
relies
was
on
saying in terms of him
traditional-
stepping over
Yeah.
into a different discourse.
Well, and then and this becomes. I mean, we might not even get to this tonight, but just
No, yeah,
David seems to have no idea what to do with the low Christology idea, and it doesn't seem to understand what this has to do with gospel relationships, which is honestly kind of nothing. But yeah, so there's just a lot of problems there. That it's just everything is theology and apologetics fronted, and not literary relationships. So
or history.
Yeah.
And also, like, to be clear, just up front, both of us agree that Paul has a high Christology.
Oh no! Mark has a high
might.
Christology
Yeah.
in several sequences.
Yeah.
I think there's like a really good case to be made for it. Like I don't.
I totally agree.
Well, and then I don't. Let's
But-
not get down this road.
No. But
yeah.
what I mean is, we agree with David, if he's still watching. We
Yeah.
agree with you that Paul has a high divine Christology. Okay, we agree with you on 1 Corinthians. We agree with you on Paul's quotation
Yeah.
of the Shema, right? That Jesus is included in the divine identity. Okay,
Mhm.
early on, prior to Mark,
Yeah.
that's fine. Mark might have a high Christology. I'm really not sure myself. I don't know. We're not interested in the sort of like developmental evolutionary
but-
account of like Christology where like stuff goes from lower to higher.
No.
I don't think most people are nowadays. Like,
It is an incredibly dated argument about New Testament theology generally, but more to the point, it doesn't have anything to do with gospel relations. Like it's
Yeah.
unless kind of John, but even that was complicated because a lot of people just think John is independent, right? So
Yeah.
I mean, I am really interested in Mark's arguments about Mark Goodacre's arguments about John as dependent, but it doesn't, again, it has nothing to do with literary relationships between the gospel. There's a lot of getting sidetracked here, I think. So
Yeah, I think the only thing I would say is that like the sort of Christological evolution where seems to be something people bring up like on the opposite end of like counter apologetics.
there's a
online.
there's a
well,
whole different
so-
conversation happening
Yeah.
among apologists and counter apologists
Yeah.
that is at best adjacent to scholarship and most fully detached.
Yeah,
And,
but I'll just note that to say that that's kind of I'll give that's probably why David would think something
Sure.
like that is
and
more,
I mean, we
more
both
important
admit
to
that, like,
address.
someone like Bart Ehrman makes the evolutionary move.
No, he does.
does.
and a lot of that is just like
from low to high.
Yeah, and honestly, a big part of that is just the fact that he's a really traditional scholar. And I think that a lot of that stuff has been scrambled.
Yeah,
honestly, so
he's also just bad at Paul. Like
Well,
he's a bad.
I disagree with him.
He's a
about
bad
lot of
reader
stuff,
of
yeah.
Paul.
I mean, there's a lot of stuff I really like Bart on. Paul is not one of them. I think that I'm not going to get way in the weeds with this, but again, like if your relationship with New Testament scholarship is primarily mediated by Bart, it's not even that Bart is an outlier.
Yeah,
it's that Bart is
he's old school.
Yeah, he's old school,
Yeah.
right? Like a lot of the stuff is just really dated.
He is. Yeah.
And it is also not relevant to what he's been working on for some time.
Yeah,
so.
which is a very different thing. Yeah.
Well, and then that's the thing is like
Mhm.
there's this argument early on in the video of like, all of the dates of, all the arguments for Markan Priority are so dated and they've all been turned over, right? And there's just no real engagement with the fact that like Adele Yarborough Collins talks about it in her Hermeneia commentary, and Joel talks about it in his. We'll get to Joel, whatever that was. That there's a defense of it in Mark 1-8, and the fact that Mark has taken this quite seriously on an internal level in his arguments against Q, but I don't think David can really engage them because he just keeps kind of getting interested in his own thing, which is fine, but then just don't make a video about Markan Priority.
Yeah. Also, just be honest about what you're doing. Yeah. Are you wanting to harmonize things?
Yeah.
Is that what you're doing? Tell us that up front. Just say that. I want to harmonize these texts. Okay?
Yeah.
Just be honest.
Well,
and if that's the case, then don't engage in these conversations at all, because you're gonna inevitably, which is what he does, step over into those tendencies. Yeah. Because those are the pressures that are coming through into a text. Any text, right? Well, that's just gonna happen.
And I want to be really clear about what I mean there of like maybe step back. It's not because like I'm not even trying to gatekeep this conversation, because
no. That's not what I'm saying.
It's not that
either.
some people are not qualified to do this.
No.
It's just that like, is this really what you want to talk about? That to me is the more essential thing. There are a lot of interesting conversations in the academy out there, and if you don't want to really talk about literary relationships between the gospels, then maybe don't start here, right? So and I'm not trying to. I don't want my primary point to be that don't try it, right? That's not my point, because I think anybody can take on any subject in the New Testament and like really dive into the literature and learn something, especially in this age of social media where like so many scholars are so accessible and a lot of them are out of work and would love to share their research with you. I think there's a lot of stuff to be happening on the lay scholarship front. It's just there's the question of, do you understand the questions you are asking? And everything, if we're going to talk about Markan Priority, the place you start is editorial fatigue and whether or not you can argue relationships in the other direction. And then you start to get to this question of material that might be added or subtracted according to redactional profiles. These are the things that are being discussed, right? And I think that
he never talks about redactional profiles, because there are so many examples. If you go the other way around, it does not make sense. Like if you go from Mark using Matthew, none of it makes sense. As someone who would be writing a gospel, okay, David would say it's a different kind of gospel. We've already talked about how that's not really the case. It's someone writing a bios, right? That's what it is. It's a story about Jesus. It's a story trying to capture who Jesus was, right? If it works the other way around, I mean, we can talk about the virgin birth, resurrection.
and that's-
we can talk about Lord's Prayer. Here,
Yeah.
if it works the opposite way that we think it does, why does Mark leave out the virgin birth? Well, I don't know. Maybe he doesn't think it's important. That seems weird for someone who's a Christian, and they would have access to that. Why would someone leave out the resurrection appearances when Mark himself references future resurrection appearances? Why is he kind of like not contradicting himself, but having some sort of tension there within his own? Like, why would he not include that stuff in his own story when he already thinks it's going to happen? Why wouldn't you include that? With the Lord's Prayer, Mark Goodegger talks about how a lot of the stuff in the Lord's Prayer in Matthew and Luke it corresponds to so much that's going on in Mark.
Mm-hmm.
Why wouldn't he have a Lord's Prayer in that situation if it's going the other direction? Why wouldn't he have that there?
Well, when we're talking about redactional profiles and individual,
and that's why it's implausible for
Yeah.
Mark's redactional profile.
Yeah.
Yeah, it
And
doesn't make any sense.
There's a lot of stuff to push back on of of what I think one big question you would have to answer is, what do you think these gospels are doing in regards to Jewish and Gentile audiences?
Oh, sure.
And,
that's a great point.
Yeah, because he
starts
off by pushing against the idea. At some point, David argues that the Semiticism's in the gospel. He resists the idea that this is an earlier thing that's supposed to appeal to Jewish Christians, which I that part I'm totally sympathetic to.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But then doesn't really account for the idea that Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians would be distinct audiences for gospels, right? That I don't know, a lot of that stuff just doesn't really fit. And then the place he takes the Semiticisms is that, well, Peter gave them to Mark because of the apostolic preaching that's informing this. In which case, if you want to go with Peter being a voice behind this, like literally, very literally, the voice of Peter saying what Jesus actually said, I assume then you want to say that Matthew is the voice behind Matthew, in which case, how come Matthew forgot all the Semiticism? Which seems very odd. And also, how come Matthew doesn't actually care about appealing to Jewish Christians in light of the fact that he's the one with all the Torah observance, right? Yeah. So that's all very strange, right? And if I had to come, at some point, we could sit here all night and go through each element of David's attempt to do the scholarship and just pick it apart. And on one hand, we'd probably all learn something. On the other hand, it would be very tedious and very difficult to order. But I think the central thing is that at the end of the day, the problem that is happening here is that David is addressing a problem of literary relationships, and he is trying to make them fit with the order that is ascribed to them in the tradition of like Irenaeus and to some extent Papias, even though Papias has Markan Priority, and for some reason
no one gets
David
that.
doesn't care, and I don't know why. Like Irenaeus and then eventually Augustine. But where a lot of these ideas of apostolic authorship come from, they don't include literary relationships after some point. Now, Papias does have them, right? He says that like Mark wrote first from preaching, and then Matthew put them in order, but he did in Hebrew, and everyone interpreted as well as he was able. Matthew's not in Hebrew; it's not a translation of Hebrew. Okay, fine. But when you get into these later conversations of these as being the memoirs of apostles, they're not accounting for a literary relationship, right? They are thinking of these as independent visions. And so this is the thing that's happening, is that David both wants it to be true that the Gospels have a literary relationship that I guess doesn't include Mark first, even though he doesn't say who would be first. But he also wants it to be true that Peter is informing Mark, and yet somehow Mark is not first. So what is happening here, right? So are we assuming a literary relationship or not? and if we are assuming a literary relationship, are we saying that Matthew is somehow before the preaching of Peter? So I guess it's just the actual Matthew, and we're just going to forget the whole thing about Hebrew and all that stuff. Or Markan Priority from Papias, fine. If Matthew is first, and then Mark gets his hands on it, but he's correcting it with Peter's preaching. What is the criteria you're using to determine this from the text themselves? What is the evidence of this putative external source that we can't get from Matthew itself? Right? So I mean, at some point, there's this kind of like quick knocking down of a very flat reading of these arguments, this idea that like there's all these contradictions, but there's no external building of a case of gospels with literary relationships that also have what I think David is committed to, even though it's very hard to tell sometimes, that there are these external oral voices that are also present in the text that have in themselves no distinctive voice, except for apparently what seems like just random details, right? You know, that like Jesus was sleeping on a cushion, and Mark couldn't have gotten that from anywhere but Peter, I guess. You know, so I don't know. There's none of this works, is what I'm trying to say. None of this works.
Yeah,
But-
so to kind of like
just
some
real quick.
Okay, go ahead.
Because I think we do need to kind of
I know.
finish up.
I've been going for a
and-
long
No,
time.
no.
Yeah.
I mean,
No,
we can
this has
do-
been great.
We can do a part 2 as well.
Yeah.
I think.
I would like to work on the Christology thing. I think that's an interesting point. And I would also like to work from my end on a longer construction of why I think Markan Priority makes sense, right? And that would be the argument that I think you would need to deconstruct to resist something else. Or just the question of what does David think happened first? So
Jonathan Becker seems very fascinated by this naked dude. I'm just throwing that out.
It's very funny.
I mean, it's one of the most distinctive elements of Mark.
I mean,
right?
David didn't really, he mentioned it, but yeah. What I will say is I think there's no question that Markan Priority is the simplest way of going about this stuff. It makes the most sense. It has the most explanatory power and scope. I think there's no question, which is why most scholars agree with it. It has this stuff. Now, if you're coming from this from a place that like we need to harmonize everything, I have an apologetic agenda where I'm just gonna kind of come in and make sure that everything is, I need the text to be 100% consistent all the way through, right? Then of course you're not gonna buy it, right? But that says more about the person who's coming in than the historians who are, many of whom are Christians, most of whom are Christians, actually, who are doing this stuff.
I can name one non-Christian.
Yeah. Most of whom are Christians who are coming at this and just wanting to pay attention to the details of this stuff in terms of literary dependence. Okay. But if you're coming in and being like, I need to harmonize everything because it has to be that, then you're going to see things differently. But don't pretend like you're actually coming in and critiquing, Markan Priority. You're not.
Well,
Especially given the sources that he relies on, that David relies on, they're so dated. Most of them are just dead. They're just dead guys. They're dead white guys. Like it's
and also
insane.
I was trying to dig up some of these sources he was drawing on. They're not out there. This is just so obscure, right? And as opposed to people who have really been like working on redaction criticism, and also like Q theory. Like, why not take on Q? Why not bring in people who are still defenders of Q, who still defend Markan? Like, why not bring in that group? So there's a lot of stuff going on here, and like what I'm really trying to be careful is my argument here is not that nobody needs to listen to David. That's not my point. My point is that I found it when I sat down and watched this video for the first time, and I started to think about how to respond to it. I kept realizing that I didn't have a great answer because I kept stumbling upon the fact that this is not the synoptic debate as academics know it, right? This is not the synoptic problem as academics know it. This is a light defense of the apostolic tradition about gospel origins with some engagement with the idea of Markan priority, but mostly interested in the problem of harmonization. And I think what I find very frustrating about it is that, like, if you want, like, let's say you want to go with Matthean priority, right? Let's say you want to do that. Okay, then get out Papias, deal with the fact that he says Mark was first, deal with the fact that he says Matthew is in Hebrew, go through it and like figure out what and like deal with Irenaeus, deal with Augustine, talk about the narratives and like how these people are using each other and citing each other, and figure out what that case actually is, and then put it in conversation with what we have here. Because if you want to construct a case for gospel order and not even relations, right? Like, I'm not even saying an argument for gospel relationships. If you want to talk about gospel order from the patristic narratives, fine. But make sure you actually understand what it is. Because I feel like what's happening here is that the primary argument really doesn't have anything to do with literary relationships. It's that Mark is not first because that would cede too much to critical scholarship. And then beyond that, it doesn't really matter who happened first because there's no real envisioned idea of literary relationships outside of a very light one that is very dependent on external sources whose existence David can't posit or demonstrate evidence for. And that they all are basically saying the same thing, right? And they're not, right? And because that's sort of the problem is that if you want to talk about gospel origins, you have to take redaction profiles and embassies and differences seriously.
And he never takes redaction profiles seriously
and especially,
at all.
And I think part of what's
we never really got into that either.
No.
Because like we could have gone through verses by verses by verses about redaction profiles.
Mm-hmm.
And like I'm happy to do it, and I know you're happy to do it.
I mean, Matthew's my bread and butter.
Yeah.
Right, and you could do that, and I also think like part of what is really wild to me about this, and part of like where I'm getting like flashbacks from my days in evangelicalism, is because after being in history for so long, I don't know why trying to make all the differences line up is so important. They're so similar. The synoptics are so similar. And like nothing in history is this similar. It's just like, it's this tyranny of petty differences and this insistence that everyone has to be writing with journalistic accuracy all the time. Or otherwise the world's
What are the facts?
Yeah, or like otherwise the world's not 6,000 years old and we can marry dogs. And I don't know what is going on here. I don't quite understand. Sorry?
I just hope people understand like the sarcasm.
Yeah,
about
sorry. I'm very good. But I don't quite understand what's going on here because there's a strange meshing of history.
Actually, yeah, real quick, something that Samuel brought up. This is actually really important. He didn't give criteria like for his kind of understanding of what's going on. So to say that there is no sound argument for Markan priority is, that's exactly right, Samuel. Yeah.
Yeah, I think his comment actually leads into what I've been thinking too. So basically, like to say what you guys have been saying in another way, just rephrase it a little bit and think it through. So like basically what David's doing is like engaging with these arguments, like these arguments that say Mark Goodacre is making. These are down the line from the fact that like literary dependence is a thing. Like
it has to be. It has to be.
So by David taking these arguments and then using things like harmonization and like the historical facts to like answer these problems.
Yeah, you're stepping over.
It's not fair. It's not fair to the argument. Like if you're going to do that, then go back to where Mark Goodacre or where these scholars like where they explain why we know there's literary dependence in the first place. Don't use, you know what I mean? Like you're using an argument that's down the line and then not engaging with the establish the fact that you're able to make it to like what's the order, because it doesn't matter what the order is if there's no dependence. If they're all independent, then who cares what the order is? It literally
Well,
has
and then also
that's
no
what's so
different.
confusing.
If they are dependent, but you also want to like grandfather in this idea of everything coming from apostolic memoirs and preaching.
Yeah.
Where do they come in?
Which he's already committed to. Right. So like the fact that he's already committed to that up front, which we all know, it comes through.
Yeah.
Right. He cites Lydia McGrew on this stuff. Like he, of course, is dependent upon this sort of stuff. If that's where it's coming from, then like why even engage in this conversation?
Is McGrew the person who does the whole undesigned coincidences thing? Yeah, which to me, the thing that's always been so odd about that is like, in some ways, there's some interesting things to note of like things that kind of span across. But the problem is failure to commit to literary relationships just means that none of it makes sense, right? Is that you can't have an undesigned coincidence between texts that are dependent on each other. Like the coincidence is just the fact that it's using this text, right? That's what the coincidence. So
it's not a coincidence. It's just the fact that somebody is using another text.
Yeah, and that's like, and there's the one that's fun that I actually do think is interesting is the feeding of the 5,000 being near Bethsaida and Jesus asking somebody from Bethsaida about where to get food. That's really fun. That like this just spans gospels of like why would Jesus ask these specific people? That's really interesting. It's also a really good piece of evidence that all these gospels have a literary relationship with each other, and the person who's redacting them knows that these
in Luke. Are you talking about?
Yeah, exactly.
Because at the end it says it's a deserted place.
I know.
Bethsaida is not a deserted place.
I know.
It's a prominent fishing area.
So this is the thing, is like I feel like what's going on here is we want to take on Markan Priority, but we don't want to talk about literary relationships in the Gospels. In which case, okay.
I think to like sum up to like
some of the questions.
Just to sum up like one of my basically when David says there are no good arguments for Markan Priority, really what he's saying is none of the arguments for Markan Priority are good at fully establishing literary dependence and the order, like, and Markan Priority at the same time, when that's not the goal of the arguments for Markan Priority in the first place.
Right. So, Jonathan Becker asked about Q proponents and fatigue in the double tradition by suggesting that Luke copies Q with fatigue rather than Matthew. The vast majority of editorial fatigue arguments come from narrative texts, which aren't as much in the double tradition between Luke and Matthew. So it's not that much of a piece of the conversation, but it's an interesting question, right? The place where I've been dealing with editorial stuff a lot lately is Mark's use of verbs with no antecedents and Mark adding in the antecedents, which I think can have sort of interesting editorial fatigue vibes, or like Matthew not editing super carefully all the time. In which case, this is all interesting evidence with Markan Priority. Otherwise, we have to assume that Mark took Matthew and just got all the verbs. So, okay. And again, that makes more sense if you read Greek. I'm not trying to be that person, but it makes more sense if you read Greek. And if you don't read Greek, it's just going to be kind of rough. Okay. It's not and then like as Samuel said, it's like it's not that it's ad hominem, it just explains things. Again, like the point is not that these people are stupid and don't know what they're talking about. The point is just like trying to understand the way in which someone is entering a conversation that doesn't correspond to the way that professionals do. This is part of the question, right? Of like how do we explain this? How do we understand this? There's like anxiety about gospel contradictions. Again, the point is not that they don't know what they're talking about because they're not educated enough. That's not the argument. The point is that when you are trying to engage a conversation that seems to be starting in a really strange place and have its emphases in really odd places and doesn't really make coherent arguments, at some point you need to kind of start digging to figure out what conversation are they participating in, because it's not the academic one. And this is what just comes up, right? Sorry, do you want to keep? Yeah.
You're good. I was skimming through the comments. I mean, the only other real question was Jonathan Becker at the top talking about if it's like closer to the top, but he's like, if not,
Is this guy?
yeah, maybe. Yeah, that was a different one than I thought, but I mean, that's fine. Are these arguments regarding Markan Priority still the subject of active research, or does the field view them as so settled that it's not a frontier question anymore? Yeah, I think this is a
It's
good.
settled.
So here's what I do want to put out a little asterisk about that. Okay, so 20 years ago, you could definitely say that Is There a Q was completely closed, right? And then Mark Goodacre came along, right? And Mark Goodacre drew on Golder and some other people who had been looking at a hypothesis of Luke independent on Matthew. And now the question is not settled, right? Same with the question of John's dependence on the synoptics, that this has been kind of a false consensus over time. And there actually is a case to make of dependence of specifically like the sentence, take up your mat and walk. Where does that come from, right? There are questions that look settled that get revisited in the synoptic problem. The one that's happened in our lifetime, though not in my lifetime as a scholar, is specifically the question of whether or not there's a Q. So I want to be really clear here. The reason why Markan Priority hasn't faced serious challenge in our academic lifetimes isn't because scholarship is closed and no one will even think about it. It's because no one's presented a good argument, right? So like Q started to break down once there was a really solid case for there being no Q in scholarship. And what Mark Goodacre took that and pushed it forward with like Thomas and the synoptics, right? And John and the synoptics, right? Like this is a developing field of scholarship. And now, honestly, I think among gospel scholars, the field is fairly divided now between people who think there's a Q and people who think there's not.
Sure.
And you even have people who go for Luke being the second term and then Matthew redacting Luke. I think they're wrong, but Richard Bauckham has gone to bat for this, and I mean I think that case I think it's wrong, but you can find it, right? The cases exist. So I'm not saying that Mark being secondary isn't dead because of the closed-mindedness of the academy. It's because the good argument doesn't exist. And this won't break it, right? This isn't going to cut it. Word Power didn't break it, right? And I don't even know if he really wanted to, right? I mean, he got a PhD at South African Theological Seminary, and it doesn't look like he, it seems like, actually, I'm not going to comment on that yet because like some of my notes seem to be a bit scrambled on this front.
No,
But-
and also I don't know how much he's published in the field, so
Yeah,
that's an important
I
thing
know,
as
and
well.
I don't want to put so like I don't know if he kept that up, right? I don't know enough about him. I mean, he's not a major player in this debate, as I understand it now. But yeah, like within Priority, there's just not an active argument about it because nobody's put a good case for it. It would be really cool if someone did. This just isn't it, though.
Totally agree. Yeah. So it's I think it's good to note that the whole idea of Q and how Mark Goodacre's arguments have been really taken seriously is an example that the academy
I already
isn't just
talked about
closed off
sorry.
to these
Yeah.
ideas.
I wasn't here.
It's one of your list. Sorry.
All right.
No, you're good.
I think we got
Blah, blah,
everything.
blah.
Yeah, I think we got everything.
Cool.
Yeah, so I think I think we talked a lot about like big picture stuff and how David really fails to engage with the whole editorial fatigue argument in general. So
Well, it would be fine if he did, and I'd be interested in that. I'd be interested in that argument. And even then, like the question of do these gospels like meaningfully contradict each other? Again, a part of why scholars aren't really talking about this isn't because we're all like, yes, they contradict each other because Jesus isn't real. and the earth is not
And the
6,000.
Bible sucks.
Yeah, exactly. And we're all going to marry
We
our
hate the
dogs.
Bible.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That's not the conversation, right? The conversation is because
I hate the Bible.
Okay, all right. The conversation is that there's actually a lot of really interesting stuff to note and theological work to do when you note the differences between the Gospels and the way in which everybody's changing the other ones. And again, like Liddy McGrew has this
Right,
line.
it's hating the
that gets-
Bible. Yeah, acknowledging any sort of like rough patches means you hate the Bible,
Yeah.
and I do.
And
I'm
Liddy
convinced of
McGrew
it.
has a quote that shows up in this of just sort of like, there's no evidence that the gospel writers felt completely free to change stuff from text to text. Okay, fine.
Yeah, holy shit.
Okay, so here's the thing. In some ways, she's not wrong. 90% of Mark is in Matthew.
Yeah,
A lot of this stuff did get brought on board. That's a fair thing to point out, is that like these texts must have some kind of standing for this to be the relationship they have between each other. What it doesn't mean is that the only possible explanation for why Herodias doesn't show up in Matthew is because Peter has some specific insight into the fact that Herodias was at the heart of this whole thing, and that the daughter went and asked Herodias about what to do about John the Baptist's head. Okay, fine. At some point, we're getting to sort of we're getting to some very strange arguments that have nothing to do with anything else in history, right? That like all redactional changes are not related to the interests of the editor. It all has to do with what these voices who are off screen somewhere say actually happened, and no one will ever defer from what living memories of the gospel say happen. And people want to say that because of the way they're reading the living voice idea in Papias, which doesn't say what people want to say it says. Anyways, so the point is,
Evangelicals love Papias, don't they?
well, they kind of love Papias. They
love
don't
him on certain stuff.
They don't love Matthew being in Hebrew, and
Yeah, but they love him, and then they'll deploy him in certain ways.
It's hyper selective. Yeah. So this is the thing, is that like, and again, we're just. I keep coming back to this question of not engaging the debate, right? Of just sort of like the gospel writers didn't feel free to just make stuff up. Okay, but did they feel free to make minor changes, or to correct phrases that looked really unclear, or to put the nouns in as in Matthew, right? Or take them back out as in Mark, if we want to go that direction? Fine. If you want to say, though, that nobody felt any license to compose outside of what an apostle was saying in their ear, you have to demonstrate this. You have to prove where this voice is coming from, and
no
why.
one's done it.
No
one's done it.
In the midst of these apostolic voices, why these texts still have literary relationships with each other.
Yes.
You have to make that case. Yeah. And if you can make it, fine. That sounds like a fun conversation to have, but we're not there yet. That's not where we are.
That would be sick, actually.
I'm always up for new things, and I always want things to go back early so we can get a sense of what the early church looked like.
Yeah, sure.
No one doesn't. And also, nobody doesn't want this to happen. Yeah. Nobody doesn't want there to be reliable sources about early Christianity.
Yeah, we just don't want to make stuff up.
Right. Yeah. We just want to be cautious because we're historians. It's not that like we wanted to all be lost to history because we hate Jesus and we want it all to stop. No, we just want to actually do historical work.
Yeah, I like thinking this through, like, if this is, like if it goes back to like the actual apostles, disciple, like I always think back to Paul, and like, so why don't we see anything in Paul about like any of this, writing these books, or, I mean, I don't understand how you get, I just don't understand the whole like traditional authorship thing when you, like, then why are they even as late as they are?
It doesn't do the work people think it does.
Yeah.
And then dating is a whole other, that would be a whole other thing to talk about, is like, why are the references to the destruction of the temple so much clearer in Matthew than they are in Mark, right? Sure. And again, if you want to say it's because Matthew is first, is it because Matthew is thinking about the destruction of the temple and then Mark immediately forgot it? Okay, so there's some stuff to push back on here, but none of this. It doesn't go the way. I mean, I just keep coming back to this. This is not going to go the way you think it is, right? If you want this to come back to everybody is writing because they remember Jesus, and we can find external evidence that proves this, and everything is just like a journalistic account of Jesus that can all be put together perfectly. This isn't going to go the way you think it is, and the history is not on your side. And it would be cool if it is, but also you could be a Christian even if it's not.
No,
Exactly.
I mean, this was a great conversation for sure.
For sure.
If y'all want to like and subscribe to the channel, and also we have our Patreon, patreon.com/apocalypse here as well.
Like John said, thanks everybody for watching. And this has been Apocalypse Here.
Christianity you can live with.